Greetings and welcome to the Dr. J Vlog series. It is Saturday, May 24th, 2025. And on Saturdays, we talk about sports and hopefully sprinkle in a bit of humor along the way. And as a longtime Toronto Maple Leafs fan, we really do need humor. It's a defense mechanism. So a dozen years ago, on May 13th, 2013, I remember exactly where I was. I was watching excitedly the Toronto Maple Leafs in their Game 7 tilt, winner-take-all matchup with the Boston Bruins. And the Leafs were just cruising along, leading 4-1 well into the third period, in fact, with just about 11 minutes to play. And that's when, unfortunately, Nathan Horton scored for the Bruins. And that made it 4-2. No problem. Excuse me, the Leafs were still up 4-2. And they continued to cruise. And in fact, it was still 4-2 with less than 2 minutes to play in the game. So, game's in the bag, right? Well, not quite. Boston then scored with only 1:22 left to make it a 4-3 nail-biter. And then 30 seconds later, Patrice Bergeron scored for Boston again to tie the game at 4-4, heading into overtime. And then he ended up netting the game winner for the Bruins about 6 minutes into that overtime. Bruins win, Bruins advance, series over for the Leafs, season and series over. And my son, I remember, my son Lucas called me from university, he was a McMaster at the time, to discuss his utter amazement and disappointment at their collapse. Well, I consoled him, saying something along the lines of, "Son, we're Maple Leaf fans. We're used to pain and suffering." What I didn't realize at the time, of course, was just how much pain and suffering would be forthcoming over the next dozen years or so. So, while not quite suffering from the same collapse, the Leafs were eliminated again in Game 7 at the hands of the Boston Bruins, their nemesis, back in 2018 by a score of 7-4. And then Boston did it again to the Leafs the next year, beating them 5-1 in the deciding game of their playoff series in 2019. So that's 3 times in a row they met Boston, or at least over 2013, 18, and 19, and they lost all these Game 7s to Boston. Very frustrating. But even more incredible than that was the fact that the Leafs were continuing this unparalleled streak of losing the winner-take-all games in the playoffs by going through it again in 2020, the COVID year. And it was the Columbus Blue Jackets who sent the Leafs home 3-0 in the deciding qualifying game of their matchup. Well, it didn't end there. In 2021, the next year, the Montreal Canadiens eliminated the Leafs in Game 7 of their first round matchup by a score of 3-1. And then in 2022, and I'm not making this up, for the 5th consecutive year, meaning no breaks, nothing in between, the Tampa Bay Lightning then beat the Leafs 2-1 in, yes, another Game 7. Just an incredible streak. The wrong kind, unfortunately. Now, the good news is that in 2023, the Leafs finally got away from that series ending, or that Game 7 season-ending clincher. Instead, that year, they simply lost to the Florida Panthers 4-1. So there was no real drama as such, no embarrassment, none of that Game 7 disappointment and all that sort of stuff. Just the normal, regular disappointment of being bounced from the playoffs long before making the Stanley Cup Finals. And in fact, in case you're interested, the last time the Leafs played in the Stanley Cup Finals was back in 1967. Many of you probably weren't born yet, unless you're, my age or older. And so that was, 58 years ago. And by the way, they won the cup. So their last appearance, it was also the last time that they won the cup. But they haven't been back then in 58 years. But in recent years, they've definitely been improving. In fact, the last 4 regular seasons in a row, they've done really quite well. They've ended the seasons in each of those 4 years with more than 100 points. In other words, with strong winning records each year, if you don't follow hockey that much. So anyway, back to the whole notion of Game 7, winner-take-all games. So last year, in 2024, they again went to a Game 7 in the first round against their old nemesis, the Boston Bruins. Time for some payback, right? Time to flip the script. Well, it was a defensive struggle on that classic May 4th hockey night in Canada Saturday evening. No score entering the third period, but the Leafs finally broke the ice to make it 1-0 on William Nylander's wrist shot 9 minutes into the period. Leafs up 1-0. But for Boston, Hampus Lindholm tied it for the Bruins less than 90 seconds later, and regulation ended in a 1-1 tie. Overtime. We didn't have to wait long for this particular result, because less than 2 minutes in, you guessed it, David Pastrnak netted the game winner for the Bruins, and they advanced. So from 2013 to 2024, the Leafs played in 7 win-or-go-home games, playoff games, in the final game of a series, in other words. And they lost all 7 of those games, including 5 consecutive years from 2018 through 2022. A model of consistency, a model of futility, something almost poetic. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. It was a tale as old as most Leaf fans who've been alive can remember. And it was all of us, diehard Leafs fan, who were basically doing our best Oliver impressions and hoping, desperately, wanting something more.
Please, sir, I want some more.
What?
Please, sir, I want some more.
More?
Well, that's essentially what we're asking. Just a little bit more. Just one more round. Just one win in a Game 7. Is that too much to ask? Well, after last year's debacle, I concluded that I probably shouldn't watch the Leafs. At least, certainly not if they ended up in a Game 7 again. Because every time I've been watching them over the last decade plus, always ended in disappointment. In fact, I took it a step further. I decided not to watch the Toronto Maple Leafs at all this year. Not live, at least. I watch them on Sportsnet, or I watch the summary, the highlights, that sort of thing. But I literally never watched them live the entire year. Regular season and into the postseason as well. And guess what? As if there was some kind of causal connection, that seemed to be working. That is, the Leafs won the Atlantic Division with 108 points. They beat the Ottawa Senators 4-2 in the opening round of the playoffs. So again, they didn't have to go to that, Game 7 misery. But then they faced the defending Stanley Cup champions, the Florida Panthers, in round 2. They won the first 2 games. Florida stormed back like the great champions that they are. They won the next 3 to go up 3-2. The Leafs didn't fold. They didn't mail it in. They stuck it to the Panthers in Game 6, shutting them out, forcing a deciding Game 7 on Toronto's home ice. And so that game was then played last Sunday, May 18th, at the Scotiabank Arena in Toronto. So my son Lucas and I agreed that we should not watch the game, lest we jinx the team. And after the first period, we decided to check, and we learned that the score was 0-0. And we made another momentous decision. We said, you know what? What the heck? Let's watch. Right? Well, what's the worst that could happen? It's a silly superstition, right? To somehow think that by us watching, that would cause the Leafs to fall apart, to lose. So we turned on the telly. Just a few seconds in, there was an omen. Referee Chris Rooney took a high stick to the face and had to leave. His face was horribly bloodied. So now again, this is the beginning of the second period. So now we're watching, and when the game resumed, we settled in to cheer on our Leafs, just like we've been doing for years. Good old times. This is absolutely true. I was watching the Leafs play live for the very first time this season. I refuse to believe the jinx or the statistical superstitions of any kind. So we're going to watch this game. Let's go for it. Let's have some fun. Well, but then I noticed that the Leafs didn't look so great. Now, again, I hadn't been watching them, so who am I to judge, right? But they did seem somehow slower, a step slower than the Panthers. They seemed a bit more hesitant. They seemed less confident than the Panthers as well. They seemed to just sort of be reacting to everything on the ice rather than taking over the puck and creating. And then the Panthers ramped up the pressure a bit more. And only 3:15 into the period, again, my first time watching the Leafs this year, they scored the first goal of the game. Panthers 1, Leafs 0. Okay, time to fight back. We're the Atlantic Division champions this year. We've got a great team. Leafs made a couple of hits. They also, unfortunately, turned the puck over a couple of times. They really didn't seem to be turning up the heat that much on the Panthers. And 4 minutes later, after their first goal, that is the Panthers, they netted their second to make it 2-0. Uh-oh. Well, hey, that's the breaks, right? That's hockey. The Leafs just needed to score once, right, to get back to half that lead, to get back in the game, to make it 2-1. Then you've got yourselves a great game. Unfortunately, instead, a couple of minutes later, Tavares turned the puck over, and Florida netted its third goal of the period in less than 10 minutes, taking a commanding 3-0 lead. So we turned off the set. My total time watching the Leafs for the entire season was exactly 1/2 of one period. In the deciding Game 7 against the Florida Panthers in the second round. And it went from a 0-0 draw when I started to watch to the Leafs being down 3-0 when I turned off the set. They looked just awful. But hey, you can't blame Lucas and me. It is not our fault. Just because we decided to watch. Well, as many of you, if not all of you already know, the Leafs ended up losing on home ice in the deciding Game 7 by a score of 6-1 to the Florida Panthers. And so that's their 8th consecutive loss in a win-or-go-home deciding series game dating back to 2013. They've somehow managed to go 0-8 in all of those win-or-go-home deciding games over a 12-year span from 2013 through 2025, including 7 times in the last 8 years. I can't imagine what it must be like to go through that as a professional athlete. In total, 4 Toronto Maple Leaf players have been on the roster at least since 2018, meeting each of those 7 soul-crushing defeats, season-ending defeats in the last 8 years. Mitch Marner, Austin Matthews, William Nylander, and Morgan Riley. I hope they, and I mean this sincerely, I hope they all have very strong, loving support systems and hopefully good therapists too. So, I was still in Virginia when we got our hockey team, the Washington Capitals, back in 1974. And I hadn't even been on ice skates myself. I hadn't even learned how to skate yet. But I thought, hey, this is pretty cool. Another professional major sports team. And we have a hockey team. So I started watching. And of course, the Caps were horrible. And they posted a record of 8 wins, 67 losses, and 5 draws during that inaugural season, 1974-75. And by the way, that .131 winning percentage, still the worst in NHL history. But if you told me back then that the Washington Capitals, right, that season, if you told me that the Washington Capitals would go on to win a Stanley Cup before the vaunted Leafs would win another, again, remember their last cup was in 1967, I'd have said you're crazy. But of course, the Capitals did win a Stanley Cup in 2018. So they did beat the Leafs to the next cup, at least between the two teams, right? And as you know, you've seen what the Leafs have been up to since 2018. Just an utter disaster. And so once again, we're left saying, well, there's always next year. Let's just hope it's not like that movie Groundhog Day, which has been playing now for several years, at least for the Toronto Maple Leafs. All right, so until next time, may you and yours continue to create peace in your lives, nurture love in your hearts, and dole out hugs in abundance, but especially if you run into a long-suffering Leafs fan. Hope to see you soon.